The morning Lauren Hayes disappeared began with pancakes. Her mother, Claire, had risen early to make them from scratch, the batter thick with buttermilk. The kitchen windows cracked open to let in the September breeze that carried the smell of cut grass and late summer honeysuckle. Lauren sat at the counter in her favorite yellow sundress, the one with the tiny white flowers embroidered along the hem, swinging her bare feet while she waited. She was 7 years old, and her toes barely reached the footrest. On the floor beside her chair sat her blue canvas sandals with the daisy buckles, the ones she'd picked out herself at the start of school 2 weeks earlier. She insisted on wearing them everywhere, even though autumn was coming and Claire had tried to convince her that sneakers would be warmer. Claire remembers the exact time Lauren left the house, 9:47 in the morning. She knows because she glanced at the microwave clock when Lauren pushed her plate away and asked if she could ride her bike to Emma Castellano's house 3 blocks over. Emma's mother had called earlier to arrange the playdate. Claire said yes, helped Lauren into her helmet, and watched from the porch as her daughter pedaled down the driveway, the blue sandals flashing in the sunlight with each rotation of the pedals. Lauren turned at the corner, waved once, and disappeared behind the Richardsons' hedge. That wave, small and quick, would become the last confirmed sighting of Lauren Hayes for 15 years. If you've ever followed a case like this, or if you're drawn to stories where the impossible becomes real, consider subscribing so you don't miss what happens next. And drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. These stories connect us all, no matter the distance. By 10:30, Emma's mother, Diane Castellano, called Claire. Lauren had never arrived. Diane's voice had that careful neutrality adults use when they're trying not to alarm each other. But Claire felt her stomach drop before Diane finished the sentence. She grabbed her keys and drove the route Lauren would have taken, scanning sidewalks and front yards, her heartbeat loud in her ears. The bike wasn't there. No sign of the yellow dress, no blue sandals. She pulled into the Castellanos' driveway, and together the two women retraced every possible path on foot, calling Lauren's name. The September morning felt suddenly too bright, too warm, the cicadas too loud. By 11, Claire called the police. By noon, the quiet residential neighborhood was swarming with patrol cars. Officers knocked on doors, asking if anyone had seen a girl in a yellow dress on a pink bicycle. Most people had been inside, doing weekend chores or watching television. One neighbor, an elderly man named Gerald Pruitt, said he'd been watering his roses around 10 and thought he'd seen a bike go by, but couldn't be sure of the color or the rider. Another neighbor mentioned a white van parked near the corner earlier that morning, but she hadn't gotten a plate number and couldn't describe the driver. The van detail electrified the search. For days afterward, every white van in the county would be stopped and inspected. By mid-afternoon, volunteers began arriving. Parents from Lauren's school, members of Claire's church, co-workers from the insurance office where she processed claims. They formed search lines and walked through the wooded park at the end of the neighborhood, through drainage ditches and behind shopping centers. Canine units arrived by evening, German shepherds straining at their leashes, following scent trails that led to the corner where Gerald Pruitt had been watering his roses, then simply stopped. It was as if Lauren had evaporated into the autumn air. Her bike was found 2 days later, leaning against a dumpster behind a shuttered grocery store 4 miles away. The training wheels Claire had removed that summer still absent. The handlebar streamers Lauren had attached herself still fluttering in the wind. The blue sandals were in the bike's wire basket. That discovery, those small shoes neatly placed together as if Lauren had intended to come back for them, would haunt Claire for years. The mobilization expanded quickly. Flyers went up on every telephone pole within a 10-mile radius. Lauren's school photo smiling out from beneath the word "missing." Local television stations ran segments during evening news. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children added Lauren to their database. Tips flooded in. A woman in a neighboring county swore she'd seen a girl matching Lauren's description at a rest stop. Police raced there, interviewed employees, reviewed grainy security footage. The girl turned out to be 10 years old, traveling with her grandmother. Another caller reported a yellow dress in a thrift store donation bin. It wasn't Lauren's. Each false lead consumed resources, raised hopes, then extinguished them. Claire began to recognize the particular tone in the detective's voice when he called with updates that weren't really updates, the careful gentleness that meant another dead end. Jurisdiction became an issue. The bike had been found across county lines, which meant 2 sheriff's departments and the state police all had to coordinate. Meetings were held, task forces assembled. A lead detective emerged, a man named Frank Ortega, who had worked missing children cases for 2 decades. He had kind eyes and a methodical way of speaking that made Claire feel, briefly, that someone competent was in control. Ortega explained the realities. The first 48 hours were critical, and those had passed. Most children who were abducted by strangers didn't survive beyond that window. But he also told her about children who'd been found alive years later, held captive in basements or sheds, and Claire didn't know if that possibility was meant to comfort or terrify her. The toll on Claire was immediate and profound. She stopped going to work. She couldn't sleep in her own bed because it meant being in the house where Lauren should have been. She moved to the couch, surrounded by search maps and tip sheets, surviving on coffee and the casseroles neighbors left on the porch. Her husband, David, had left 2 years before Lauren disappeared, an affair, a quick divorce, minimal contact afterward. He appeared at the police station 3 days in, visibly shaken, and cooperated with investigators, but he had an alibi that checked out and no custody motive. The guilt he felt for having been absent when Lauren vanished seemed to consume him. Within 6 months, he moved out of state. Claire never saw him again. The house became a shrine. Claire left Lauren's room exactly as it had been. The bed stayed made, the stuffed animals arranged on the pillow, the nightlight plugged in and glowing every evening. She washed the yellow sundress and hung it in the closet, unable to donate it or put it away. Birthdays were unbearable. On Lauren's 8th, Claire baked a cake and sang to an empty room, then threw the cake in the trash and sobbed on the kitchen floor until a neighbor heard her and came inside. Holidays were marked by Lauren's absence. Christmas mornings felt obscene. Claire stopped decorating. People stopped asking how she was because the answer was always the same, still searching. The community tried to help, but the attention waned. Within 6 months, most people had returned to their routines. The case grew cold. Ortega retired after 12 years, and the file passed to younger detectives who had their own active cases. Claire attended support groups for parents of missing children, where she met others trapped in the same limbo, too traumatized to move forward, too hopeful to accept the worst. She learned the term ambiguous loss, the kind that has no closure, no body, no funeral, no way to grieve properly. It was a suspended sentence, a life on pause, waiting for a phone call that might never come. But she never stopped. Every year, on the anniversary of Lauren's disappearance, Claire reposted the flyers on social media. She called the police department monthly, reminding them that the case was still open, that Lauren was still missing. She updated age progression photos as new software became available, showing what Lauren might look like at 9, at 12, at 15, at 18. Those digital projections were eerie. They resembled Claire's own childhood photos, the same narrow chin and hazel eyes, but they were also strangers. Claire didn't know if Lauren would recognize herself in those images. She didn't know if Lauren was even alive to see them. The procedural thread never fully unraveled. Ortega had explained early on how DNA databases worked, how biological samples from Lauren's toothbrush and hairbrush had been sent to CODIS, the combined DNA index system, in case unidentified remains were ever found. Claire's own DNA was on file too, a reference sample. Every few months, the lab would run comparisons, looking for matches. Nothing ever came back. Investigators also monitored the National Crime Information Center database, which tracked runaways, juvenile arrests, hospital admissions. Lauren's name was flagged in systems across the country. If she had ever been picked up by police, enrolled in a school under her real name, or sought medical care with her social security number, an alert would have triggered. Year after year, nothing triggered. Technology advanced. Facial recognition software became more sophisticated. Social media platforms emerged, and Claire created profiles in Lauren's name, hoping that someday her daughter might search for herself and find them. She joined online communities dedicated to solving cold cases, where amateur investigators traded theories and pored over timelines. Some of those theories were helpful, others were cruel. Claire learned to ignore the people who suggested she'd harmed her own child, the ones who pointed out that parental involvement was statistically common. She'd taken polygraphs, submitted to interviews, opened every corner of her life to scrutiny. She had nothing to hide except the hollow space where her daughter used to be. Then, in the 14th year, something shifted. A social worker in a city 200 miles away was processing intake paperwork for a young woman who'd come to a shelter after leaving what she described as a controlling relationship. The woman was 21 years old, quiet and watchful, with a habit of flinching when doors closed too loudly. She gave her name as Michaela Ross. During the interview, she mentioned that she didn't have many childhood memories, that things before age 8 were fuzzy. The social worker, a woman named Janine Ortiz who'd been in the field long enough to recognize dissociative patterns, made a note. Later, when Michaela applied for a replacement social security card, a clerical cross-check flagged an inconsistency. The number Michaela provided had been issued to a different name in a different state. It was a minor discrepancy, the kind that might have been overlooked, but Janine followed protocol and contacted the fraud unit. The fraud investigator ran the number through federal databases. It belonged to Lauren Hayes, reported missing in 2010. The investigator called the police department that had filed the original report. The detective who answered was young, unfamiliar with the case, but she pulled the file and saw that it was still open. She called Claire. The conversation was cautious. They'd had false alarms before, administrative errors, identity theft cases where someone used a missing child's social security number. But the investigator mentioned that this young woman was currently at a shelter, that she was safe, and that they'd like to arrange a DNA test to confirm identity. Claire's hands shook so violently she dropped the phone. The DNA test took 3 days to process. Claire spent those days in a fog, unable to eat or think clearly. She didn't tell anyone except her closest friend, afraid to hope, afraid of another crushing disappointment. When the call came, it was the young detective, her voice careful and measured. The DNA was a match. The woman calling herself Michaela Ross was Lauren Hayes. She'd been alive all this time. Claire's knees buckled and she sat down hard on the kitchen floor, the same floor where she'd once sung Happy Birthday to an empty room. The detective explained that Lauren had agreed to meet her, but that Claire needed to prepare herself. 15 years was a long time. Lauren might not remember her. She might not want to come home. The encounter was arranged at the police station, in a room with soft lighting and comfortable chairs that was designed for victim interviews. Claire arrived early, her heart hammering so hard she thought she might faint. Janine Ortiz was there, and the detective and a trauma counselor who explained gently that reunions like this could be overwhelming for everyone involved. Claire nodded, barely hearing. All she could think about was the last time she'd seen Lauren, the wave from the bicycle, the blue sandals flashing in the sunlight. Would Lauren remember that morning? Would she remember the pancakes, the yellow dress, the way Claire used to braid her hair before school? When the door opened, Claire's breath stopped. The woman who walked in was tall and thin with long dark hair and the same hazel eyes Claire saw in the mirror every morning. She was wearing jeans and an oversized sweater, her movements tentative, her gaze fixed on the floor. She looked older than 21, worn in a way that spoke of hard years. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Lauren looked up, her expression uncertain, and said quietly, "They told me you're my mom." Claire wanted to rush forward, to wrap her arms around this stranger who was her daughter. But the counselor had warned her to let Lauren set the pace. So she stayed in her chair and said, voice breaking, "I am. I've been looking for you for 15 years. Lauren's face didn't change. She nodded slowly, as if processing information from a great distance. "I don't remember," she said. "I don't remember you. I don't remember any of it." The counselor intervened gently, explaining that memory loss wasn't uncommon in cases of prolonged trauma, that Lauren's brain might have protected her by suppressing early memories. They talked for an hour, Claire answering Lauren's questions about what her life had been like before, showing her photos on her phone. Lauren as a baby, as a toddler, blowing out candles on her 7th birthday. Lauren studied the images with a kind of detached curiosity, as if looking at pictures of someone else's child. At one point, Claire mentioned the blue sandals, how Lauren had loved them, how they'd been found in the bike basket. Lauren's expression flickered, something unreadable crossing her face, but she didn't say anything. Before they parted, Lauren asked, "Why did you say, 'You're my family,' like that?" Claire was confused. She hadn't said that. The detective leaned forward. "Lauren, did someone tell you that phrase? Did someone use those words?" Lauren's face went blank, the way it had when Claire first walked into the room. "I think so," she said finally. "When I was little, someone kept saying it, 'You're my family now,' over and over." The room went very quiet. The detective made a note. That phrase would become central to the investigation that followed. The truth emerged slowly, painfully, over the next several months. Lauren agreed to stay in the area, moving into transitional housing, while investigators pieced together what had happened. She worked with a therapist who specialized in trauma and dissociation, and gradually fragments of memory began to surface. She remembered a woman with red hair. She remembered a small house with peeling paint. She remembered being told that her real mother didn't want her anymore, that she had a new family now. She remembered celebrations of a birthday in November, even though her actual birthday was in March. She remembered being enrolled in homeschool programs under a false name, never attending public school, never seeing a doctor. She remembered growing up isolated, told that the outside world was dangerous, that if she ever tried to leave or tell anyone who she really was, terrible things would happen to people she loved. The woman with the red hair was named Sandra Kemp. She'd been in her mid-40s in 2010, living alone after a divorce, struggling with untreated mental illness and a history of pregnancy losses. According to investigators, Sandra had been driving through Claire's neighborhood that September morning and had seen Lauren on the bicycle. What exactly motivated her actions in that moment was unclear. Whether it was premeditated or impulsive, whether she'd been looking for a child to take or simply saw an opportunity, she'd stopped, told Lauren that her mother had sent her to pick her up, that there was an emergency. Lauren, trusting and 7 years old, had gone with her. Sandra had taken Lauren's bike and left it across town to misdirect the search, keeping the blue sandals as a kind of token. For years, those sandals sat on a shelf in Sandra's bedroom, a symbol of possession. Sandra had moved twice over the years, always staying within the state, always keeping Lauren isolated. She'd homeschooled her using outdated textbooks and called her Michaela, after a daughter she'd lost to miscarriage decades earlier. She'd been meticulous about avoiding detection. No school enrollment, no hospital visits, no photographs posted online. Lauren had been hidden in plain sight, a ghost in official records. As Lauren grew older and started asking questions, Sandra became increasingly controlling, monitoring her movements, restricting her access to the internet, threatening consequences. When Lauren turned 18 and legally became an adult, Sandra's hold weakened slightly, but the psychological conditioning was so deep that it took 3 more years before Lauren found the courage to leave. The breakthrough came when Lauren met someone at a grocery store where she'd been allowed to work. A young man who noticed bruises on her arms and offered her a phone number for a domestic violence hotline. It took Lauren months to call, but eventually she did. The hotline connected her to Janine Ortiz's shelter. Even then, Lauren hadn't known she was a missing person. She'd believed on some level that her mother, her real mother, had abandoned her, just as Sandra had always said. It was only when Janine started asking questions and the social security discrepancy appeared that the truth began to unravel. Sandra Kemp was arrested 6 weeks after Lauren's identity was confirmed. She'd been living in a small rental house on the outskirts of town, still keeping Lauren's room intact, even though Lauren had been gone for months. Police found the blue sandals on a shelf, along with newspaper clippings about Lauren's disappearance and age progression photos Claire had posted online. Sandra had been following the case for years, perhaps as a way to hold on to the fantasy that Michaela, Lauren, was truly hers. During interrogation, Sandra showed little remorse. She insisted she'd saved Lauren from a bad situation, that she'd given her a better life. The delusion was complete. The legal proceedings were complex. Sandra was charged with kidnapping, child endangerment, and identity fraud. She was found competent to stand trial, and a jury convicted her on all counts. She was sentenced to 45 years in prison. For Claire, the verdict brought a measure of justice, but it didn't heal the wounds. Lauren, she'd asked to be called Lauren again, slowly reclaiming her original identity, was dealing with her own complicated grief. She mourned the years she'd lost, the childhood that had been stolen. She also grieved, in a confusing way, for the only parental figure she'd known for most of her conscious life, even though that figure had been her captor. Trauma therapists called it a form of attachment disorder, a survival mechanism that had helped her endure captivity. Reunification was not simple or fairy tale smooth. Lauren and Claire had to build a relationship from scratch, learning each other as adults rather than as mother and daughter. There were setbacks. Lauren struggled with crowds, with authority figures, with trusting people. She had nightmares. She sometimes called Claire by her first name instead of Mom, because the word felt too loaded, too unfamiliar. Claire, for her part, had to resist the urge to be overprotective, to smother Lauren with the love she'd been unable to give for 15 years. They attended therapy together, working through boundaries and expectations. Some days were good, some were impossibly hard, but there were moments of grace. One afternoon, Claire was cleaning out the garage and found a box of Lauren's old things, school papers, drawings, toys she'd outgrown. At the bottom was the yellow sundress, carefully folded. Claire brought it inside, unsure whether showing it to Lauren would help or hurt. Lauren held it up, running her fingers over the embroidered flowers. "I think I remember this," she said quietly. "I think I remember pancakes." It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. Witnesses complicated the picture. As news of Lauren's return spread, people who'd been involved in the original search began coming forward with their own recollections. Gerald Pruitt, the man who'd been watering roses, insisted he'd seen Lauren ride past that morning, heading toward the Castellanos' house. But another neighbor, who'd only recently moved into the area and hadn't been interviewed in 2010, said she'd seen a girl on a bike turn in the opposite direction, away from the Castellanos. The timelines didn't quite match. Investigators revisited statements from 15 years earlier, and found small inconsistencies, discrepancies that happened when memory collides with time. Human recollection is fragile, shaped by suggestion and emotion. Some of the details that had seemed so certain in 2010 turned out to be reconstructions, the mind's way of filling gaps. It didn't change the core truth that Lauren had been taken, but it reminded everyone how easily memory could shift, even with the best intentions. Lauren herself struggled with fragmented recall. Therapy helped unlock some memories, but others remained inaccessible, perhaps permanently. She remembered the blue sandals now, remembered loving them, remembered putting them in the bike basket before riding that morning. But the actual moment of Sandra's approach, the words that convinced her to get into a car, the immediate aftermath, those memories were gone or buried too deep to retrieve. The therapist explained that this was the brain protecting itself, that Lauren might never fully recover those hours. Claire made peace with that. What mattered was that Lauren was here, alive, trying to reclaim a future. In the aftermath, Claire channeled her energy into advocacy. She began speaking at conferences for missing and exploited children, sharing Lauren's story as a message of hope, but also of vigilance. She worked with legislators to improve protocols for cross-referencing social security numbers and identification documents, closing the loopholes that had allowed Sandra to enroll Lauren in homeschool programs without proper verification. She partnered with organizations that trained social workers to recognize signs of hidden children and coerced identities. The work gave her purpose, a way to transform 15 years of anguish into something that might prevent another family's suffering. Lauren slowly found her own path. She enrolled in community college, studying psychology with the hope of eventually working with trauma survivors. She maintained boundaries with the media, declining most interview requests, preferring privacy to publicity. She and Claire spoke regularly, sometimes daily, sometimes going a week without contact when Lauren needed space. It wasn't the relationship Claire had dreamed of during all those years of searching, but it was real, and it was theirs, built on honesty and hard-won trust. The blue sandals, preserved as evidence during the trial, were eventually returned to Claire. She kept them in a memory box, along with the yellow sundress and Lauren's school photos. They were relics of a childhood interrupted, symbols of innocence and loss, but also of survival. Lauren saw them once and smiled, a small, sad smile that contained multitudes. "They're so tiny," she said. "I can't believe my feet were ever that small." On the 15th anniversary of Lauren's disappearance, now reframed as the anniversary of the day she was taken, Claire and Lauren planted a tree in the backyard. It was a Japanese maple, chosen for its resilience and its beauty. They didn't make speeches or invite cameras. It was just the two of them, shoveling dirt and pressing soil around roots, marking time in a quieter way. Claire thought about all the years she'd spent waiting, all the false leads and dead ends, all the nights she'd stared at the ceiling, wondering if Lauren was alive. She thought about the improbable sequence of events that had led to Lauren's identification, the social worker who'd asked the right questions, the clerical match that could have been ignored. How easily Lauren could have remained lost, but she wasn't lost anymore. The road ahead would be long, marked by therapy sessions and memory gaps and the complicated work of healing. There would be good days and setbacks. There would be moments when the past felt too heavy to carry, but they would carry it together, mother and daughter, separated by 15 years and reunited by persistence and chance. The story didn't have a perfect ending because real life rarely does, but it had an ending that allowed for hope, for growth, for the possibility that even the most profound losses could, in some measure, be recovered. For other families still searching, Claire had simple advice: never stop looking, never stop hoping, and never underestimate the power of a single piece of information in the right hands. Share photos, update registries, stay in touch with investigators even when the case goes cold. Advocate for better systems, for stronger protections, for the kind of interagency coordination that can catch discrepancies before they become tragedies. Support organizations like the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, which provides resources and maintains databases. Trust that even in the darkest silence, there might be a voice waiting to be heard. Lauren Hayes returned after 15 years, saying to the woman who'd raised her in captivity, "You're my family." Words that had been weaponized as control. Later, when witness memories were examined under the scrutiny of time, details clashed and shifted, reminding everyone that truth is both solid and fragile. But through the confusion and the gaps, through the trauma and the slow rebuilding, one truth remained constant. Claire never stopped being Lauren's mother, and Lauren, despite everything stolen from her, never stopped being Claire's daughter. The years between were a wound that would never fully close, but from that wound grew something unexpected: resilience, purpose, and a fierce determination to ensure that no other child would vanish so completely or for so long. The blue sandals rest in their box, small and worn, a testament to a morning in September when a girl pedaled away from everything she knew. They're a reminder of what was lost and what, against staggering odds, was found.